Our next speaker is also remote. We're going to have Jeff Walker from Walker Environmental Research talk a little bit about Upper Klamath Lake and long-term trends and nutrient dynamics. So Jeff, if you're ready to share your screen. Yes, you are.
Yep. All
Thanks
right.
for being ready. All right. And go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Randy. Good to be back. It's about a year ago was my first KBMP meeting. So this is now my second. And yeah, we got some new results to present. So let's dive into it. I'm sure most of you are familiar. Upper Klamath Lake is a shallow hypereutrophic lake. It's located in the upper part of the basin, way up here. Let me just see if I switch to a laser pointer. Okay. Look it up in the upper part of the basin. It suffers from pretty severe cyanobacteria blooms, so you can see in the satellite photo. These are driven both by external phosphorus loading, so all the phosphorus coming from the watershed through watershed runoff, spring seepage, pumping from agricultural areas around the lake. There's also considerable internal loading, which is the release of phosphorus from the sediment into the water column, so coming from below. And we're going to talk more about those two sources and how they're related. These blooms cause a variety of water quality impairments like low dissolved oxygen, high pH, which then has detrimental effects on native and endangered sucker species within the lake. And the water quality in the lake itself is not only a problem for the ecology within the lake, it also has impacts downstream, since the outflow of Upper Klamath Lake forms the Klamath River. So poor water quality in the lake can cause problems downstream and in the lower and middle basins. So I'm going to talk today about the development of a mass balance data set for the lake. Give me one second here. And this is the third iteration of this data set. The first one was done in 1999 by Jake and my father, Bill Walker. I did not participate in that one because I was, I think, a sophomore in high school at the time. But the three of us did an update to that in 2012, where we extended the data set through 2010. And now Jake and I have done our third update, extending it through 2018. So another 8 years of data since the last iteration, for a grand total of 27 years period of record, which is a pretty long data set, and one of the few in the country that I'm aware of. Clicker's not working. There we go. So the data set itself is useful as a basis for studying the lake, and it's been used in a variety of studies and different analyses. The first mass balance data set was used to support the development of the TMDL model, total maximum daily load, which called for a 40% reduction in external loads in order to reduce or eliminate the water quality impairments in cyanobacteria blooms. Data set was also used by USGS for a series of modeling studies that focused on reviewing and refining that TMDL model. In 2012, we did a long-term trend analysis looking at whether flows and concentrations and loads were changing over time throughout the lake basin. And 2 years ago, Jake and I did a study focusing on the phosphorus dynamics as related to the inflows and the outflows and sediment exchanges within the lake. And that was the study that we presented this time last year. So today I'm really going to focus on this new study. So again, the goal was to update our monthly mass balance data set. We extended the period of record through 2018, so 8 additional years. For the most part, we used pretty similar data sources and methodologies as our previous studies, so it's fairly consistent. One major change was we used the new lake bathymetry data set, which puts the lake at about 2 feet deeper than it used to be. And although that can have some implications for water quality, in terms of the mass balance, it didn't really make a big difference because we're mostly looking at the fluxes into and out of the lake. So changing the bathymetry didn't change that too much. So once we had the data set put together, we also updated our inflow outflow study from 2 years ago, because the previous one we were using the old data set, which only went through 2010. So we've updated those analyses, with the new data set, with these additional 8 years of data, provided a nice opportunity to do like a validation of that study. We also updated our long-term trends of the seasonal annual flows, loads, and concentrations. And to kind of assess how much progress has been made towards meeting the TMDL goals, we generated new estimates of the anthropogenic and background sources of loading to the lake. And this study was funded by Fish and Wildlife Service through a contract with Klamath Tribes. So let's talk about mass balance sort of in general. So the goal here is to really just create an accounting of all the inflows and outflows of the lake. So for the water balance, we've got a series of different types of inflows. We've got gauge tributaries, which are like the Williamson, the Wood, and the 7 Mile, which all have a stream flow gauge on them. So we know how much flow is going into the lake from those. We've got estimates of the amount of water pumped from agricultural areas. And then we've got these ungauged inflows, which is basically the amount of inflow coming from all the other drainage area in the basin. So mostly those springs and seeps and other ungauged portions of the drainage area. And that was calculated by difference from all the other terms. We also have fluxes from precipitation and evaporation, as well as the outflow, which is measured by a flow gauge. And then we've got the lake volume itself, which we measure based on the recorded lake elevation and then the bathymetric curves. So altogether, we've got this one mass balance equation. This, the change of volume is the sum of the inflows minus the sum of the outflows. Now we've got a similar thing for phosphorus, although the terms are a little bit different. We've got phosphorus loading from the different inflows, again, gauged tributaries, pumped areas, and ungauged. We've got phosphorus loading from atmospheric deposition, which includes both wet and dry deposition. We've got phosphorus mass leaving the lake through the outflow. And then we've got this really important term, which is the net retention. And what this is it represents the overall net exchange of phosphorus between the lake water column and the sediment. And really there's kind of two fluxes involved there. One is the settling of phosphorus from the water to the sedimentation. So that's a downward flux. And then you've also got the release of phosphorus, which is from the sediment back into the water column. So that's sometimes called recycling, also just sediment flux or release flux. But you've got these two fluxes going opposite directions, and they're pretty hard to measure independently. And so for this study, we grouped them together and we just called it the net retention. So if it's a positive value, that means there's more sedimentation than release. So more phosphorus going from the water column to the sediment. And if it's negative, it's going the other direction where there's more coming from the sediment back into the water column. And then I'll also mention that in the report, we do mass balance of total nitrogen also, but I'm just going to talk about phosphorus for the interest of time and because the lake itself is primarily phosphorus limited. So that's our real management goal. So this is a pretty dry table and I will not go through it really in any detail, but I just flashed it up here to mention that we have a whole bunch of these tables in the report. I know they're kind of a handy reference if you're doing other studies in the basin. So it's basically a big accounting of all the inflow terms in terms of flows and nutrient loads and concentrations. We report the fraction of the total inflows associated with each of these different terms. So for example, the Williamson is about 50% of the total flow volume. Then we've got the pumped areas, ungauged inflows, and so on. So we've got all these terms here tabulated over different periods. This is the period of record from 92 through 2018. We also do individual years and multi-year periods. So this is in the report. Also mentioned that the data set itself is available online to download. Previously, it was in a PDF table in an appendix of the report. So we made it a little more accessible and just uploaded a CSV file that you can download that's got the monthly flows, loads, and concentrations for each term. So once we put the data set together, first thing we can look at is sort of the long-term dynamics. So this is looking at the total inflows into the lake. So we got flows on top, annual flows, annual TP loads, and then the annual flow weighted mean TP concentrations. And so we've got all the different inflow terms here. We've got precipitation, the pumped inflows, the ungauged, the gauged, and then the orange is the total external inflows, which So total, like overall concentration of all inflows, that only appears down here on the bottom. And then the sum of any of these bars would be the total external inflows for the flows and loads. The only thing I was going to point out here is that the 90s, 92, the 99, 2000 were relatively wet compared to the last 20 years or so. So this dotted line is the long-term mean annual flow here. So you can see since 2001, only 3 water years have had flows above the long-term mean, and the rest of them have been below. So it's been drier for the past 20 years than it was in the 90s. And as we'll see later, that has some implications in terms of how we interpret the TMDL for the lake, which was developed in 2000 and based really just on the 90s, so kind of high flow years. Similar picture for phosphorus loads, which are primarily driven by the flows. So we had higher loads in the 90s, lower in the last 20 years, except for those high flow years. One other thing to note is there's a lot more purple in these bars, which means that most of the flows and loads come from the gauged tributaries. So I mentioned earlier, about 50% comes from the Williamson. Then we've got a lot from the Wood and the 7 Mile as well. The other thing we can see here is the blue, which is the pumped inflow loads. So if we look at the flows, the blue is really just a small sliver of the flows into the lake. It's not huge, but it's definitely bigger for the loads, and that's because the pumped inflows have a higher concentration, which you can see on the bottom. And so a greater fraction of the total inflows was from the pumped areas, but that fraction has kind of dwindled over time. So in the last 3 years, that sliver has kind of gotten smaller and smaller. And that's in large part thanks to the restoration of the Agency Lake Ranch and the Williamson Delta. Okay, let's look at this seasonally. So this is a plot that we came up with for that inflow-outflow study we did 2 years ago, where we're trying to look at kind of what are the seasonal dynamics of inflows, outflows, and sediment exchanges. And so here we're just looking at essentially the total inflow, accounting for precipitation and evaporation, which is called the net inflow. We got the total outflow, and the orange is the net retention term, which is that net exchange between the sediment and the water column. And these are just long-term average monthly values going from May to April. So for flows on the top, we've plotted these so that anything leaving the lake is a negative value and anything coming in is a positive value. So you can see in the summer, outflows are greater than inflows, and these dots represent the change in storage. And so that's negative. So during the summer, there's more outflow than there is inflow, and the lake surface is dropping because the volume is getting smaller. And then in the winter, inflows exceed outflows and the lake refills. So that's kind of the annual hydrologic cycle of the lake. Overall, if you take the average across all months, inflows and outflows are pretty much balanced, which makes sense since the lake is not really getting bigger or smaller over the long term. If we look at loads, so a couple of interesting things. So first, these, again, the orange bars is the net exchange of phosphorus between the water column and the sediment. And when it's positive, as it is in June and July, that indicates a net release from the sediment into the lake. And so this is our internal loading into the lake. And you can see that these are pretty large compared to both the inflows and the outflows. I think it's a factor of 8 larger than the inflows in July, and it's more than double the outflows. And so this is really a major driver of the water quality in the lake, and also one of the major drivers of the cyanobacteria blooms. In August, those blooms begin to die and they settle out. And so we switch from a net release to a net sedimentation, which kind of persists for the rest of the year. So that's from a phosphorus standpoint, the cycle is a large release in the summer, and then for the rest of the year, there's this sedimentation back to the sediment. And lastly, if we look at the concentrations, just notice that the outflow concentration, which is closely correlated with the concentration within the lake, really spikes up in July and August, over 200 parts per billion. And that's reflecting primarily this release of phosphorus from the inflows, because even though the inflow concentrations are high, which we'll talk more about in a minute, the loads are actually small compared to those releases. So it's the releases driving the higher concentrations in the outflow in the lake. So mentioned that study we did 2 years ago. We presented last time, and in that study, we looked at the relationships between the inflow, outflow, and net retention, sort of on a seasonal basis. And what we found was a series of correlations between these seasonal fluxes, to kind of walk through in this example on the right. So we've got 2 water years, and we found this relationship between the net inflow load during winter. So how much load is coming into the lake in the winter. If that's high, then you end up getting a lot of net retention in the winter. So a lot more phosphorus in the winter, then you get a lot of that settling out. And then there was a correlation between the amount settling out in the winter and the amount released the following summer. So if you have a winter that had high loads, a lot of it settled out, the following summer, you tended to see higher releases. And then when you have higher releases, then you get more outflow, higher concentrations and higher loads in the outflow. And so these correlations look like this, just a series of scatter plots. So in the top left, we've got that winter net inflow load being positively correlated with the net retention load in winter. And then the net retention load is correlated with the following summer's net release. And then this summer's net release is correlated with the summer outflow load. And the outflow load is correlated with the outflow concentration. So these series of correlations basically provided support for what we call this rapid sediment cycling hypothesis, which is essentially that the phosphorus release in summer is driven in large part by the external loads that occurred during the previous winter. And this is in contrast to what we call the legacy phosphorus hypothesis, which is that sediment release during summer is driven less by what's happened recently and more by the long-term accumulation of legacy phosphorus in the sediment. So if the sediment release was driven by legacy phosphorus, you wouldn't expect it to really be related to the external inflows recently. But that's not kind of what we're finding. We're finding these series of correlations which suggest the release in the summer is related to the loading from the previous winter. So the next analysis we updated was our long-term trend analysis. So this is showing the estimated trend slopes in percent per year for each term in terms of flow, TP load, and concentration. The colors of the points represent whether the trend is increasing or decreasing and what the significance level is. So if it's a dark red color, then it's an increasing trend with a low p-value less than 0.05. If it's orange, then it's still increasing, but the p-value is a little bit higher, sort of that moderate significance between 0.05 and 0.1. If it's gray, then we consider that no trend or no significant trend, and then blues for the decreasing trends. And I'm not going to walk through all of these. I'm going to kind of focus on one or just a couple really key points. One is that if we look at the trends in phosphorus concentrations coming into the lake, we saw decreasing trends from almost all the inflow sources, with the exceptions of 7 Mile and a station in the Upper Wood. But across all the other, in the Sprague and the Williamson, and the pumped inflows especially, again, thanks to that restoration work in the Agency Lake Ranch and Williamson Delta, all of these saw decreasing trends. And if you add them all together, we found a decreasing trend of about 0.5% per year for the total external inflows, which equates to about 0.5 part per billion per year. So it's not a large trend, but it is significant based on the p-value, and it's about 0.5%. So over 27 years, that means that external inflow concentrations have decreased by about 13 parts per billion. But one thing that was puzzling was if we looked at the outflow and the lake mean storage, we didn't see any trend. And so this kind of contradicted what we were finding with our previous analysis, where the outflow loads seem to be tied pretty closely to recent inflow loads. So you would expect that if the inflow loads go down, that we would see decreasing outflow loads and also decreasing concentrations within the lake. But we didn't see any trend. And so that was a bit of a head scratcher until we kind of realized that maybe evaporation was having an effect here. And normally I don't really think about evaporation having much of an effect on water quality because it doesn't remove mass, it only removes water. But we found this increasing trend in evaporation rates from the lake, which reflects higher air temperatures and just the changes to the climate. And when we started looking into it more, it turned out that evaporation is actually a pretty significant component of the overall water budget of the lake. So if we look at, again, on a seasonal basis, we've got the purple line here is, this is the long-term average total inflows. The orange line is the net difference between precip and evap, which in the summer, there's really no precipitation, so it's all evaporation. So if we look in July, we found there's about 100 million cubic meters of inflow water, but there's about 50 million cubic meters of water lost due to evaporation. So about 50% of the inflow water during the summer is a loss to evaporation. And in the mass balance, we have a term called the net inflow, which is just the sum of the total external inflows, the purple line, plus the net precip and evap, the orange line. So if you add the purple line and the orange line, you get this green line, which is our net inflow. So yeah, evaporation is about 50% of the total inflow volume. And then we're able to calculate that decreasing inflow concentration trend, which was about 0.5 part per billion per year, is actually offset almost exactly by the increasing evaporation trend, which if you calculate the change in the lake concentration due to that increasing evaporation over time, which again is small but significant, we found that loss of water, or that greater loss of water over time, is enough to increase the lake concentration by about 0.5 part per billion. So it seems like our decreasing inflow concentration trend is offset by our increasing evaporation trend, which is causing the lake to become more concentrated in the summer. And so this was a pretty interesting new result that we hadn't found before. The last section was to look at the anthropogenic versus background loading. So this is a way of sort of evaluating how much progress we've made towards the TMDL targets. So we've got the total inflows, flows, loads, and concentrations again. And the way we do this is we just take the total inflows and we assume a constant background concentration of 65 parts per billion, which is about average of measured in springs and seeps around the basin. And then whatever the difference between that background concentration or load is and the total is what we attribute to anthropogenic. So anthropogenic loads and concentrations are calculated by difference. And overall, kind of, there's two main points. One is that, so I mentioned earlier, the TMDL was done in 2000, and it was based on data through 1998. And we know that the 90s were relatively wet. And so this dotted line is the average flow and then the average load during the TMDL baseline period during the 90s. And so we see that, similar to comparing against the mean, as we did earlier, the annual flows in the last 20 years have consistently, except in 3 years, been lower than that TMDL baseline. So things have been drier than they were during the TMDL study. Similarly, for loads, we actually almost meet the target TMDL load in some years. In 2014 and 15, we were pretty close. But that's in large part because the flows were so much lower. And so really when we're trying to address or evaluate the progress towards the TMDL, we kind of focus on the concentration. And so even though we're close on the loads, we're still got a ways to go for the concentration. So our target here is this dotted line, and the red is sort of the portion of the total inflow concentration attributed to anthropogenic sources. The black line here is the 10-year rolling average of these. So it's sort of a way to smooth out these year-to-year variations. And you see that this is decreasing over time. So that's consistent with our trend analysis, which showed that inflow concentrations are going down over time. But it's slow progress. I think it's gone down about 8 parts per billion over the past 20 years. And in the last couple of years, last 3 years, has actually kind of leveled off. And whether that means that it's, what that means exactly is unclear, because it could just be reflecting the 2017 was a wet year with a high concentration. So whether this keeps going down or not remains to be seen. Yeah, so, right. So the overall, we can basically say that we've kind of achieved about 23% of the reductions necessary to meet our TMDL goals. So we've gone from up here about 100 down to about 98 or so, or 92. So overall, found that there's definitely been some progress towards meeting the TMDL load reduction targets, but we still need further reductions to meet that final target. The extended data set continued to support our rapid sediment cycling hypothesis, which suggested that Upper Klamath Lake may respond relatively rapidly to external load reductions. But it's important to consider that the time scale over which the lake restoration occurs depends primarily on the time scale of over which the load reductions occur. So it may respond relatively quickly, but if it takes 100 years for us to achieve the rest of that load reduction that's necessary, then it's still going to take 100 years for the lake to be restored. So it may respond fast, but it really depends on the time scale over which the reductions occur. And then our new finding from this study was that the decreases in inflow concentration seem to be offset by this rising evaporation rate. And so this is another effect of climate change, we think, that evaporation rates continue to increase. It's going to continue to concentrate the lake more and more. And although that's may not seem like good news, you have to consider that if we didn't have any TP reductions, conditions would actually be getting worse due to evaporation. So we may not have any trends in the outflow concentrations or the concentrations within the lake. But if we didn't have that decrease in inflow concentrations, we'd probably be seeing rising concentrations in the lake due to evaporation. So overall, this really highlights the need for rapid watershed restoration to reduce the phosphorus load and try to improve the water quality in the lake. And this is also important for reducing the export of nutrients and organic matter downstream to the Klamath River, because that export then affects the productivity and the salmon disease dynamics downstream. So I want to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service for funding and the Klamath Tribes for putting the project together. Also thanks to Megan Skinner for a technical review, an early draft of the report that was really helpful. And this was all made possible by the great sampling efforts by the Klamath Tribes and analysis by the Sprague River Water Quality Lab. And so with that, take any questions.
All right, that was great, Jeff. Let's see. I want to start it off. You mentioned earlier in the talk about when the updated bathymetry was done, the lake, Upper Klamath Lake, was 2 feet deeper. Is that related to lake levels and management, or is it just, I don't know, that's just a really odd,
it's
surprising result.
Yeah, it's not related to management. It's more of a datum issue, we think. I don't know what the original cause was, but basically what happened was there was some discrepancy in, I think, fish sampling data where they measured depths in the lake and sort of the bathymetry that we were using originally, which dated back to 1996. And as we looked at the discrepancy more and more, there was some updated bathymetry collected, and it turned out that there are like the area, capacity, depth, volume curves we were using, those shifted, and those shifted to show that the lake was actually 2 feet deeper on average. But no, that was not a management. That was really just a data thing.
Yeah, that Randy, that appeared to be actually a datum issue in the Bureau of Reclamation's original 1996 bathymetry that they had there, because it's about the same as the difference between the BOR datum and the NAVD. I forget which one, 80, 88 or one of those. But anyway, so it was really more of a issue like that.
Great. And for everyone, that was Jake Kann, who was a co-author and co-star on this whole presentation, who's driving right now. So thanks for that that answer. Laurel Ganzoli asked, can you or Jake explain the sediment nutrient export during the bloom season a little bit more? Assuming the ability for algae to take up and export the sediment nutrients are wind dependent.
Let me see. I'm not sure. Let me see if I can see the question here.
Yeah.
I could start, Laurel. So, the bloom is lake wide, right? And there's outflow going, that's being regulated, and natural outflow is going downstream. And so when you're talking about export, if you're meaning like what's being exported to the river, there's this constant flux of algae essentially leaving the lake during the summer. But I'm not sure if that's what you were actually asking in terms of the wind.
Well, I was looking at it looked like there was more sediment nutrient export in the summer. Was that right? You had the orange bars in like July and August showing, right there.
I see what you're talking about, export from the sediment to the water column then.
Totally, which is it's interesting, because in rivers we try to relate like water column nutrients to benthic algae, and here you're looking at sediment nutrients to planktonic algae. So it's an interesting kind of flip side. But I'm assuming there's some like wind mobilization to like stir up the sediment nutrients that are in that.
Yeah, that's one of many mechanisms. What actually dictates the release has to do with microbial activity, has to do with benthic macroinvertebrates, it has to do with gradients, from concentration gradients, low to high. It has to do with wind mixing, and there's many, and some of the USGS papers have kind of listed those, and it's very difficult to determine which ones are most important during the season. But it's a combination of mechanisms that's actually, and wind resuspension would be one of those.
So I guess my ultimate question there was, you guys find a correlation with the previous season's loading to how much is being exported. Is there also is that also restricted by like if it's a windy summer or not, or maybe those other things Jake just listed? Or is it kind of like there's always plenty of mobilization from the sediment to the plankton during that season?
Well, I would say there's always plenty of mobilization occurring, that those various mechanisms are kind of always at play. And I mean, you might get more if you had a windier year, but that's not the only mechanism operating in it. There's this definite seasonal signal as the lake begins to warm up. These various mechanisms kind of kick into place.
Okay. I'm going to go with Rick's question first. The TMDL target annual mean is 110 parts per billion for total phosphorus. Is the FWM mean represent the annual mean?
FWM stands for flow weighted mean, which is it's the total load divided by the total flow is how you get the flow weighted mean. So it's not an arithmetic mean of the concentrations. I'm not sure which TMDL he's referring to for 110, because in the lake the target is 66, I think.
Not for the TMDL. It's not. It's listed in their TMDL. Their target concentration is 110 parts per billion. It's lower for seasonal, but that's the overall annual mean. That's in the TMDL.
66 is the target for the inflows.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
right.
That's for the inflows of the rivers and streams. But
yeah. So flow weighted mean is usually that's the average concentration coming from the tributaries. It can be annual or it could be a long term, depends on what context. Like here, we're talking about these are annual flow weighted means.
so that doesn't necessarily represent the lake annual means.
No, this is just talking about inflows into the lake. Right. You wouldn't do a flow weighted mean for the lake itself. You do like an area weighted mean because it's you're using samples at stations throughout the lake.
Right. Just wanted to be clear on that.
Yeah.
Because I've seen those levels quite a bit lower, or generally lower than 110. So
Eli Asarian has a question that kind of gets back to the point of, lower precipitation and total inflow in recent years, and how that affects, that load versus concentration measure. So if TMDL targets are based on chlorophyll relationships in the lake, then, kind of should that be updated in light of this increasing evaporation, point? I don't know if it's more of a regulatory question. So I don't mean to hit you with that, Jeff, but I think it's an interesting one. And, yeah, if most of our success towards meeting the the load reduction is due to less inflow, that it's still seems like there's a long way to go. And
Yeah, what I meant was, has evaporation changed? Is its effect on nutrient concentrations in the lake strong enough that the TMDL targets need to be revisited? Not necessarily from a regulatory perspective, but just does the models that were developed, are they still valid for current conditions?
Yeah, I don't think it affects it that much. It's certainly kind of like within the margin of error of the TMDL analysis. So we're talking about 0.5 part per billion per year is the effect of the evaporation that we found. And I mean, if anything, I think the bigger issue with the targets is that they were developed in the 90s, which were much, much wetter, right? Which I tried to highlight in this slide. So there's any number of reasons you may want to recalculate the targets, but in terms of that relationship, the evaporation would affect both the phosphorus concentration and chlorophyll. So I hadn't really thought about it, but I think it would not have that big of an effect as to, invalidate those findings or results. But certainly something to consider.
All right. And then one last question from Clayton. The intent of the TMDL for total phosphorus concentration targets is to reduce algal biomass levels. Have you conducted a probability of nuisance bloom analysis for Upper Klamath Lake, like the one you previously did for Iron Gate?
Hey, Randy, if I could butt in too, because this is Clayton, and it sort of bears on Eli's point, which is this consideration of the adequacy of the targets. I mean, if you could link it to this goes back to a model development that Jake did for earlier on the reservoirs, and it's a way that you could evaluate the impact of that concentration effect from evaporation on TMDL targets. So it's just a thought. Anyway.
Yeah, that's something that I think we'd like to do is to look more at the trends in actual chlorophyll in Upper Klamath Lake, which wasn't part of this study. And so that's something if there's interest in that, we want it would definitely be relevant.
So that technique could be, I mean, I don't know if you ever applied it to Upper Klamath Lake, Jake, but it certainly was informative and helpful within the reservoirs. If you remember that analysis, I think it was based on a Dodds or something.
Yeah, it's a cross tabulation analysis that I think is what you're referring to. But there's that, and there's also just the kind of trend analysis that Jeff was showing here for the nutrients, looking at that for chlorophyll as well, and other water quality parameters.
All right.
Thanks.
Great. Well, that's a great presentation. And, just as a general reminder, Upper Klamath Lake and, the hypereutrophic conditions there are what drives a lot of the water quality problems all the way down to the estuary. And so understanding what's happening in the lake and the inputs are essential for us to really be able to solve the water quality issues in the main stem Klamath. So really got to appreciate Jeff and Jake and everyone else who's working on those issues upstream. So thanks for that great talk.
Thanks, Randy.